people on the line here. Great. Welcome, everybody. I was fooled by my screen here. So we are recording the call today so that we have a record of it. And as you, I'm sure many of you have gone on and listened to the prior two events. It makes for scintillating listening, especially next to the debates. It's actually quite fun. But speaking seriously, I do want to. We wanted to sort of have a record of what we've been talking about, and along with some note taking, and then also have the PowerPoint slides that we'll be putting up, and also a recording, because there are, as we've noticed over the last couple of weeks, some conversations that are really quite good and forging some new territory here. And so it would be really great to hold on to them, because there's some really cool, interesting, great ideas coming out of that. So with that said, I think everybody has probably joined. We have about 30 people on the call right now. You can see that on the controls if you're on the Zoom conference. So again, I'm Daniel Stein, and I think I have unmuted my video, so you can see my. There you go. Couple of brave people that put their faces up there. It makes the conversation more interesting if you can show. Sean, you get extra points today. Marcella, you get half the points because you've got your picture, and Paul, you get the bonus points for being on there as well. Suzanne, I think we have a beautiful picture off the coast of California, but I don't think you're there right now, if I'm not mistaken. So, anyway. Joviality aside, welcome back to the Let's Get Technical group. And today we are going to be continuing our conversation. As I've said in the past, and many of you have also contributed to the conversation, this is very much a work in progress. It is evolving and developing. We were, as we were just getting started about a month ago, a little bit more, we got a little overwhelmed with the enthusiasm and the excitement around some of the ideas, and launched right into this conversation around data standards and how best to sort of reconcile the differences, so to speak, or reconcile the different roles for the different standards that are out there, at least a few that we've been able to identify so far. And so that conversation has taken us through a couple of different webinar sessions, and we're going to be continuing that today as we get through. So just one thing, folks, if you are on the phone and you're in a public space, if you don't mind muting yourself, I can mute everybody here, but if you just don't mind muting yourself, that would be terrific if you've got background noise, because it does reverberate a bit here. So again, I'm Daniel Stein. Some housekeeping, none of which will be all that surprising. Do join the Zoom if you can. Show us your Friday face, and we'll appreciate that. As I said, you can communicate with us, all the speakers and all the participants, in the chat box down below in the menu. Write your questions, and also if there's a function to raise your proverbial hand. But also, what we're trying to do here is encourage people to break in to the conversation. And it's a little bit of non-PC webinar behavior, but we feel like more voices, the better. And be bold when you want to add your voice or add a question, or by all means, raise your hand or add a comment or a question to the chat group. As I said, we will be recording it. We actually are recording it, I believe. And you can find more information. Many of you have joined the hub and the group in particular. What we're going to do is, I'm going to show you the agenda here. So our agenda for today is not all that much different than the last agenda. What we've been doing as a tradition here is inviting anybody new to the group to actually say just a few words, because there may be a lot of people, just who you are, what you're doing, what you're working on, and just so we know who's on the group. Because it's been growing and changing, and it's very exciting, all the people who are on. It's very cool to have to know where people are from who are on the call. I might also add that on the hub, you can find people's profiles, and so you can learn more about them, people who are participating in this group, and you can, of course, engage in conversation. So I'm just going to, just in a moment, ask for some introductions for folks. And if you're online, you can see on the right side of your screen, I think, or on my screen, I can see the people. So we're just going to go from top to bottom because I don't know who's not and who is new to it. And then what we're going to do is I'm just going to give you literally a 3-minute overview of the NIC and the hub and the Let's Get Technical group, just for people who are new, and just to orient folks to it. And then we're going to dive right into the conversation today, which is going to be opened up by Dave Walsh, and then Brian Hanspicker, who presented a little bit last time, is going to talk about some of the NIEM scenarios that he just had the brief opportunity last week to introduce. I'm going to turn it over to Paul as a responder, and then we ideally will jump into a conversation for most of the time. We are scheduled for an hour and a half. We went over last time. The conversation was quite extraordinary. So if we need the time and people can stay, we've allocated it. If by some chance we get done early, then we'll just bridge our conversation. So Let's Get Technical launched at the end of April. We currently now have actually 140 people who have signed up on the group, which was pretty astounding. It came out of the summit that we held with San Diego County a couple months ago, and this desire for a place and a location to actually have a little more technical conversation, dive into the details. And so that's evolved from that. And as of today, we have had over 140 people actually express interest in participating. Our group moderator, the young, handsome, dashing Dave Walsh, whose picture you can see here, who will speak to you shortly. You can also check his real picture out on LinkedIn, but I'm just kidding, Dave. So before I go any further, let's just go down the list here very quickly, as I said. And if you haven't introduced yourself, or if you feel a penchant for saying a few words, let's just take a couple of minutes now and jump in, say who you are, where you're from, what you're doing. And you can see on your list, I don't know everybody's first name here, so go ahead and introduce yourself. Who would be the first person up?
I'll go. My name's Jeff Morningstar. I'm an IT manager at Arlington County, Virginia. I've been with the Arlington County now for a little over 2 months. And I work at the Department of Human Services, and I oversee the application development teams.
Excellent.
Hi, this is Marcy.
Yeah.
Oh, hey there. Sorry, this is Marcy McCoy-Ross, and I'm the project director for the NICE project, which is a National Electronic Interstate Compact Enterprise. We use NIEM standards to connect the states that are participating, and we have 32 states on board currently.
Cool.
This is Jeff Wendt. I'm Vice President of Healthcare Solutions for CMA. We're a systems integrator based out of Albany, New York, the prime contractor for New York State's Medicaid data warehouse and the analytics that sit atop of it. And we're working with clients aside from the state of New York that are asking us to unify data from a variety of different sources and make it consumable for those who have authorized access rights.
Thanks, Jeff.
Hi, this is Elizabeth Reed with General Dynamics. I'm a program manager who works on innovation projects.
Where are you located?
Currently in Columbus, Ohio.
Wonderful. Welcome. Thanks for joining. Who's up?
Hi, I'm Lisa Klotzbach, and I'm a nurse informaticist with Olmsted County in Minnesota, located in Rochester, Minnesota. I'm interested in this because I have been primarily serving our public health agency, but our county has undergone a reorganization, and now I also service our traditional community health or community services areas, and we're very interested in getting interoperability going just even within our own county between our different public health and community service areas.
Welcome. Great to have you on board.
Hi, my name is
Dan
Kristen.
Chavez, San Diego Health Connect.
Thanks, Jen. Go ahead.
Eric John. I'm with Alexandria Consulting and based out of St. Petersburg, Florida, and we're building HS Link, which is a platform as a service for health and human services and incorporating elements of social determinants of health.
Fantastic. Great. Welcome.
Hi, and Noam Arts in beautiful Palm Springs, California, where it's going up to about 115 today.
A nice cool day, huh, Noam? We had that a bit out here in New York. Yes.
Hi, sorry, this is Christina Becker with APHSA.
Hi, Christina.
Christine McCoy with the Visiting Nurse Association of Central Jersey. We're a community health agency that has been trying to build a platform to connect all of the different programs that we implement throughout New Jersey. And we also were one of the authors of our state's application for the CMS Integrated Care for Kids grant. And we have a couple of meetings coming up with the state next week. So just trying to be as fluent in this language as possible. I'm a family doctor, not a tech person, but I seem to be thrown in with tech people constantly.
They're gentle, don't worry.
Hi, Neil Rosenblatt, California Department of Public Health.
Hey, Neil.
Hi, Karen Smith, formerly California Department of Public Health.
Welcome.
Hi, I'm Kirsten Hun-Blair from Lambent Data, also in New Jersey, and we're building a collaborative software platform and app to engage social service practitioners and the families they serve. So we're eager to make sure to build in these interoperability features.
This is Brian Hanspicker. This is Brian Hanspicker. I'm one of the federal health architects, currently the technical lead for NIEM Health. And as a technical person, I can say we're mostly harmless.
This is Sean Yoshikawa, ICE Cybersecurity in downtown San Diego.
Any other new folks?
This is Kate Ryan. This is my second call, and I'm the project manager for the NIEM Health Community of Interest for the Federal Health Architecture.
Excellent.
Larry Israan with Clinical Informatics based in California.
Oh, hey, Larry. Glad you made it.
Happy to be here.
All right. Going once, going twice. Any other new people?
Ford Winslow with ICE Cybersecurity.
Oh, hi, Ford.
Hey.
And did I see Joe Warren on the call with us? Not to call him out.
Yes, I'm on the call. I'm sorry. I was mute. Yeah, this is Joe Warren. I work with ACF. I'm in the interoperability team with Chris Trevor.
Excellent. Great. Okay, well, welcome everybody. This is quite a robust team. I'm glad to see we've got East, West, Midwest, Southeast, Northeast. I think we got a lot of the states covered, which is great. It's nice geographic coverage there. And again, welcome to everyone. And let me just give you a few minutes of, since there are a number of new people on here, let me just give you a little brief overview of the NIC. NIC got started about 2 years ago, and we are a community of networks, and we are designed explicitly to increase collaboration within and across multiple disciplines. And as you'll see, we are our ambitious goal is to be engaging and working across human services writ large. That includes a lot of things: public health, education, public safety, emergency medical response, and healthcare IT as well. So that's not, I mean, that encompasses a lot of different territories. and we've done work in some of them and are believing that especially major problems and challenges that we face today really requires the ability to interface across those domains, sometimes regularly, sometimes just infrequently. But it is a compelling idea that has gotten some traction. And specifically, our program officer, David Fukuzawa, who's the managing director at Kresge Family Foundation, is a supporter of our work, and as is the foundation. So we're delighted to have their support and the work that they're doing to develop integrated health and human services. I encourage you to go to their site and look at, they're doing some wonderful stuff, and they're a progressive funder who actually is looking at combining health and human services, which I think is one of the few large foundations that's actually thinking about cross-domain kind of work. The NIC came out of over a decade of experience and work that Stewards Change has done with participants, lots and lots of folks from across the country, focused on innovation, interoperability, system change, and what we like to call the sort of from a systems engineering perspective, how do you connect and share data and information from across various systems without rebuilding the whole thing, so to speak. Lots of information on Stewards about our past activities that contribute to the topics we'll be talking about, and what a number of people have voiced already on just the introductions around getting introduced to some of the concepts and ideas. And one of the main points is to try to stop recreating the wheel a little bit and move the agenda forward. And the way we do that is through a number of activities, convening like we are doing today, bringing people together from different domains and sectors. We've built this National Interoperability Hub, which is a first attempt to provide a platform for people to come together, and have been involved with doing scans and publishing some findings and some research, and some case studies, playbooks, and have been focused a lot on developing some chapters, in particular in New England and in California, and also help organize national and regional symposia, some of whom on the call may have participated in. And you can find a lot more about the NIC online. The actual hub itself, I won't show you a picture of it. Most of you have been to it. The idea is really to connect people, to be able to exchange ideas, discuss, and achieve what our goals are. And we have had a pretty tremendous response so far. There's over 600 members. There's 8 groups that have been formed to varying degrees of participation. There's almost 600 resources, 88% engagement rate, 5,000 visitors, and surprisingly, what terrific statistic is, as we track it, there's been over 60,000 page views of the material that we put up there. And so it's really telling us a little bit about the level of engagement and the interest. So it is a work in progress. I'll be the first person to say that. And your participation contribution, both in consuming the information but also contributing to it, will only help it grow. My mantra is that collaboration ought to happen during the 9 to 5 part of the day and not just weekends and evenings, along with the coders. But if it becomes part of our job, becomes part of people's work, we will actually make some progress in that area. And taking whether or not it's 15 minutes a week or 2 hours a week like we're doing here will contribute to that national body of knowledge. And so as you go onto the website, you'll see a variety of different resources that we've developed. Many of under the NIC, they're available for download, from introductions to social determinants to playbooks on opioids, paper on domains, artificial intelligence, governance, and interoperability, as well as confidentiality. All these things are up there and available for your consumption as you like. And some of them are very recent, some of them are a few years old. And as I mentioned before, our main supporter is the Kresge Foundation. And over time, we have had support from IBM, Microsoft, NIEC, and others. So I want to just make sure we thank our sponsors and our supporters who may have been on or may be on. And with that, let's turn to the actual topics of today. But before I hand it to Brian, let me just pause for 1 second or 2 seconds, see if there's any questions or comments before we get started, and then I'll ask Dave Walsh to open up the conversation for us and set the context for today.
Stuart, quick question. Will the presentation material be posted on the website afterwards?
Yes, we will post it, and it'll be in the Let's Get Technical Hub section. So if you are members, you'll be able to get it. If you're not, you just have to sign up. Very quick process, and so it'll be available. And feel free to comment on it as you said, as you like. Okay, with that, let me turn it over to Dave Walsh. And Dave, why don't you give us an orientation, and then we'll move along.
Sure. Yeah, so I'm Dave Walsh. My background is has been focused primarily in healthcare and specifically in the Medicaid domain. And one of the things that all of us are seeing is with the advancements in the internet and clouds and so forth, all of a sudden we're afforded a fairly easy infrastructure to be able to exchange data. And in the introductions, I heard a lot of people talking about interoperability and exchanging data. That certainly has a number of different facets to it. I heard people talking about exchanging public health data, about exchanging healthcare data, and human services data. I certainly heard people talking about security and how do we ensure this data is secured as it goes back and forth. And all of those are complex topics that over time, hopefully the Let's Get Technical group will be addressing those. One of the biggest factors that will be a challenge is a common understanding of the data that we are exchanging. So in the healthcare world, with some recent rules coming out of CMS and ONC, there is an initiative, a set of standards called FHIR, that stands for Fast Healthcare Interoperability Resources, that are really there to try and help do two things. One is come to that common understanding of what this piece of information looks like, so that as you receive a request for that information, you understand what is being asked for and you deliver something that is being expected. And that's one of the biggest challenges that we've got, is a common understanding of the data that's being exchanged. What we have talked about FHIR in the past, and I'm sure we will talk about it again in the future, but today we're going to focus on the NIEM set of standards. So it's something that is more mature than FHIR, is more dominant in the human services space, but it is a description of what the data elements look like that we are exchanging. So today, Brian Hanspicker is going to walk us through several scenarios specifically focused on NIEM data and where they are used and where they're beneficial. After Brian is done with his presentation on that, hopefully we can get some comments from Paul Wormle, who is on the call as well and is very much an expert in NIEM. And then we can open the conversation to have everybody engage in their perspectives of the issues that need to be addressed, their perspectives on NIEM, and so forth. So with that being said, Brian, I'd like to turn the conversation over to you to walk us through the scenarios.
Certainly. My name's Brian Hanspicker. I'm the NIEM Health Community of Interest Technical Lead. And as I said earlier when I introduced myself, one of the federal health architects. Interesting, I got this interesting job because I was what the recruiters might call a purple squirrel. I am probably one of the few people in the world that's not only a certified NIEM architect, but also has spent a good deal of time in HL7 negotiating, discussing healthcare standards, as well as a number of other healthcare initiatives and standards bodies. Now, when I first came on board with NIEM Health about a year ago, my first reaction was, well, why do we really need to have a NIEM Health? We already have HL7 and FHIR is coming along. And if you're exchanging clinical information, you're bound to have an electronic health record system that's able to speak, at very least, HL7 version 2.5.1, which was required for meaningful use up through this spring, or, you know, the future of FHIR for exchanging clinical health information. But the more we looked at the wonderful world of NIEM, we found that across the 14 different domains that currently exist, plus a few community of interest, which are sort of domains in training, if you will, that there are already over 300 health-related NIEM elements that have been defined. They're defined across at least 6 of the 14 NIEM domains. And we've heard rumors that there might even be some health-related elements that have been defined in other domains that simply aren't publicly available. Those definitions aren't quite publicly available, at least not yet. And what was worse was that as I've looked at these various NIEM health-related elements, I found that it's rare to find that they are aligned with the health IT standards. And they're not necessarily all that well coordinated with across the different domain definitions that have been created either, which tells me 2 things. It tells me that there is a need for being able to exchange some types of healthcare information within NIEM. And it also tells me that there is a need for us to find a way of coordinating and realigning these health-related NIEM elements with the health IT standards. Next slide. In the process of doing that, having realized that there are requirements for NIEM domains to exchange healthcare elements, and that many of those NIEM health domains, they're just not in a position to support both NIEM and, say, you know, $1 million a year electronic health record system. That as a consequence, we need to find a way of being able to support healthcare information using NIEM, but that those healthcare definitions aren't central to, for instance, justice or emergency management or military operations or even much of human services. They're at the edge of those NIEM domains. They're still important. Healthcare, being able to exchange this limited healthcare information for each of those domains is still important to that domain, but it's not central to what they're doing. And similarly, for clinical health standards, like HL7 and FHIR, the NIEM requirements for being able to exchange information with a prison for the Justice Department, it's not really central to the clinical health requirements either. So NIEM Health is really interoperability at the domain's edge between various NIEM domains and between the clinical healthcare domain. Still important, and that motivated me to dig in and say, well, you know, what are these scenarios in which we can't just say, well, we're going to solve the problem with FHIR. Next slide. And it turns out that those scenarios are those situations in which you have to exchange some broader level of information about a circumstance across multiple agencies that also just happens to require the need to exchange some basic healthcare information. For instance, within national disaster response, if you've got a hurricane and floods, or an earthquake and tsunamis, or a drought and wildfire, there's an awful lot of emergency management that has to come to bear to deal with the situation. But there are also these circumstances where you find somebody who's been injured during the flood, and you need to be able to say, oh, by the way, hospital, I've found some, as a first responder, I found somebody who's injured in their home. This is what their circumstance is. Can you give us some advice on how to care for this person until we can get them into the hospital and actually get them into a clinical healthcare record system. Similar with multiple vehicle accidents, you've got first responders dealing with trauma victims and burn victims who need to be able to say, well, hospital, do you have enough beds for me to send all of my victims there, or do I need to send some of the victims to you and some of the victims to other folks, etc. And what's interesting about these scenarios is that they are so varied and they're spread across so many different domains, and there are so many different domains and agencies that need to work on solving these problems at the same time. An example being, and I don't want to, go dig down into the details of all of these scenarios right now, largely because my presentation, which I'm showing you, is the beginnings of one that I'm developing for the August 15th NIEM Health Symposium in Roslyn, Virginia, which I invite you all to attend, either in person or virtually. And we'll make sure that there's information on the NIC Hub for that. But would you go to the next slide? An example being, I think hurricane and flood is the next one. You'll recognize any number of Gulf Coast hurricanes in this description, including the one that we just had. But we've got specific challenges of housing destruction, infrastructure destruction, agricultural destruction, the potential of food shortfalls, epidemic illnesses as a consequence of sewage systems overwhelm, energy shortfalls because of this destruction of refineries on the coast, and of course destruction of protective wetlands. And that brings in FEMA and agriculture and the Coast Guard, the Department of Energy, the EPA, the DHS, CDC, ACF, HHS. So this is one of those examples where you've got lots of agencies that need to be involved in helping to mitigate the results of this disaster, and need to be able to exchange large amounts of information about this disaster, which, given the both the general federal government's direction and the directive from the White House, is to be exchanged via NIEM. Yet they also need to be able to include some healthcare information as well in their interactions. One of the things we talked about at last week's Let's Get Technical meeting was the idea of taking one or more of these scenarios, NIEM Health scenarios, and dig a little deeper into it, actually break it down into the specific use cases where a particular agency or a particular individual needs to exchange some actionable information. What is that information? What is the NIEM IEPD? It's called the NIEM messages that need to be exchanged. And who and how does this get implemented? With the concept that by getting a better handle on one or more of these scenarios, we might end up being able to create a proof of concept project that might include a NIEM to FHIR bridge prototype, or integrating the healthcare standards with the NIEM standards and bringing it all together into one great big happy family. And I've run out of words to say. Hard to believe, but.
So, Brian, I know that I just went back up to the prior slide. I know one of the things we had talked about last time were that there were a number of scenarios that required a data exchange between and across different organizations and across different sort of perimeters for that matter. And that there was a lot of energy around, whether or not there was one or two or some that would make interesting conversation or potentially a focus for a deeper bit of work with this group to identify what those linkages might be. What are the standards? How does health and human services exchange information on a more automated basis? And so I know that you went through the left side of the scenarios. The right side are, obviously people are looking at the screen. You may want to just say a few words about a few of those, and then maybe if our polling works, we can actually ask people to sort of weigh in on what really is most interesting to them.
Sure. Under medical record exchange, I think the 800-pound gorilla on this slide is the foster care / juvenile justice medical records collection. State level, a tribal level, territorial level, ACF agencies are required by law to collect all records that are associated with a child in state care and keep those records separate from their original systems until the child turns 18 or 21. Basically, depending on, in the case of a foster care child, whether or not the federal government is paying for their college / post-secondary technical school work. And that includes not just educational records and criminal records and family law records, but also medical records and prescription records. And in the past, from my experience with New York State and what I've seen with some other states in the New England area, that's involved a case manager getting in their car, driving to the hospital or the doctor's office, getting a printout of the child's medical records, bringing it back to the office, and then re-entering all of those medical records into their case management system, which of course is a tremendous amount of effort and time spent to collect information that really should be able to be extracted and exchanged electronically. Now, the downside is that, as with almost all social services agencies, they just don't have a whole lot of money lying around to not just implement a SACWIS or CWIS compliant case management system, but also implement the NIEM system they're required to implement for interaction with, for reporting back to the federal ACF agency, and also, spend a large amount of money buying and maintaining an electronic health record system simply to be able to collect these records and stick them in a data warehouse. So the foster care juvenile justice folks could really benefit with a mechanism that would allow them to request a medical record using NIEM, have that request turned into, say, a FHIR request, with FHIR then delivering medical records back to this NIEM server that would then turn it into a NIEM record that then their CWIS case management system could consume automatically and electronically for a particular individual foster child or juvenile justice client. So that's, now the reason it's the 800-pound gorilla is we're talking about any kind of medical record, from your standard continuity of care document all the way through to oncology records, for example. And that's where the heavy lift comes in, is there are an awful lot of different kinds of records that need to be exchanged. I think not all of which, though the FHIR experts can clarify this, but I think not all of which are yet supported by FHIR. And so there's a lot of work that would need to be done both on the NIEM side of things and on the FHIR side of things to enable that. But wounded warrior in the battlefield, there's another example where you may be using NIEM for command and control and not necessarily have an electronic health record system on the laptop in a foxhole somewhere. But if you've got a wounded warrior, you may need to be able to get some basic medical records transferred to the medic on the field to be able to determine what needs to be done in order to adequately care for the wounded. Reentry into the community after incarceration. This is one of 3 Justice Department scenarios that were identified a number of years back, where somebody coming out of a prison system is coming back into the community, and they need to be able to exchange their healthcare records with the local medical establishment, where the prison may only be using NIEM for exchanging information with the outside world, even if they happen to be using an electronic health record system within their infirmary. Substance abuse rehab with effective supervision is another one of those Justice Department examples where they're really looking for reports back to parole officers and things like that. This particular released former convict is staying on the straight and narrow with all of their tests. Tracking opioid abuse and illegal distribution networks. There's another, at the moment, very high profile challenge where we're not necessarily exchanging clinical healthcare information, but certainly exchanging health related information. And finally, we've got a case from the Coast Guard, U.S. Coast Guard, where they're concerned with being able to report when law enforcement, the Coast Guard sailor has been poisoned by drugs during a mission. For instance, when they capture a boat with a large amount of fentanyl on it, and then find that one of them has managed to touch the fentanyl with ungloved hands and gotten a poisoned dose of it. So those are all cases where we've had folks say we need to be able to exchange this health-related information using NIEM, even if it's not clinical information.
Great, thanks, thanks, Brian. I'm going to ask Paul to step in for a second, and although I want to open up the conversation as if there's any burning questions at the moment or thoughts, something that's people want to add in right at this point, and then we'll move on.
Yeah, actually, this time I have a question.
Sure.
Tom Solis, GDIT. Was it Brian that was just speaking?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Brian, have you guys looked at looking at how these things would sew together? Thinking about the way that these interchanges are described. So in the FHIR world, they seem to have borrowed a page from the HIPAA world and describing the interchanges and allowable data elements and meanings and things in terms of what a quote unquote implementation guide, as opposed to in the NIEM world, we're using things called IEPDs. Has anybody looked at how those things interoperate?
Yes, an IEPD is basically an XML schema. Just as FHIR makes use of XML or JSON for exchanging information. And on the NIEM side of things, the NIEM Technical Architecture Committee, I don't know what the C stands for in NTAC, even though I'm one of them. But the NTAC has been looking into supporting JSON as a native representation for NIEM IEPDs, schemas, if you will, as well. So there's a lot of potential alignment. There are also, as has been pointed out by others last week, some gotchas along the way that we would need to work through. So it's not a completely seamless mapping between the FHIR protocol and NIEM protocols. On the other hand, they both basically make use of either web services or RESTful services for the exchange of information. So it's not like we're trying to map an EDI-based system into an HTTP-based system, for example. So there's a good deal of, there's as much if not more commonality than differences between NIEM and FHIR. And the big issue is just how are the individual healthcare elements defined in FHIR and in NIEM, and how do we do an effective mapping or alignment between those definitions? And right now, as I said, there are over 300, there are actually over 400 healthcare related elements defined across 6+ different domains for NIEM. And they aren't aligned for the most part with either HL7 v2.5.1 or with FHIR. And as a consequence, you have to sort of bend your mind a little bit to figure out how you're going to map the value of a FHIR resource into a NIEM element. And that's something we need to work on in the coming year in putting together an effective and well-aligned mapping between healthcare standard healthcare information and NIEM elements. I don't know if I've answered your question there.
Yes, thank you.
This is Noam Arts. I spend most of my time in public health, but spend a fair amount of my time focused on in healthcare interoperability standards, sort of within the healthcare domain. You know, I have so many questions about this. I almost don't know where to begin. But let me take a step back and just ask sort of an overarching question. Is NIEM particularly focused on interoperability between domains versus within domains? Because in healthcare, you know, we have so many hurdles just to get our act together on interoperability within the healthcare domain. It's almost mind-boggling, and we have enough standards to pick from there for which NIEM isn't even on the radar. That's the thought of introducing a new set of standards, implementation guides, et cetera, to deal with health in information interoperability is almost beyond comprehension at this point.
I understand, which is why a year ago I was saying, why don't we just use HL7? Why don't we use FHIR? But the reality is that there are folks that are already exchanging health-related information within NIEM. And NIEM is intended to be, to support collaboration, information exchange, not only between domains, but also between jurisdictions. So
this is
go ahead.
Crystal from Washington State, and I can't agree more with Noam. You know, when I'm looking at these scenarios, you know, there are already folks exchanging data on a lot of the examples that you have listed here. My familiarity is with the public health area, but my you know, I can see the use case for your foster juvenile medical records collection, but I don't see any reason that you couldn't just have a FHIR query and then have that FHIR query go into your NIEM system, and your NIEM system deals with it either by creating a PDF, which is less than ideal, or by actually consuming it into your NIEM system. But I'm not seeing a use case where NIEM would need to be exchanged. I'm seeing a use case where NIEM systems would need to consume FHIR messages and create FHIR messages, but I'm just, help me with this, because I'm seeing, so much information is exchanged already in healthcare. These are looking pretty edge case to me.
Well, tonight, add something here to the discussion. This is Paul Wormle. The NIEM is really designed to focus on the issue of syntactic interoperability across domains. And it was really created to get state and local practitioners to help define the common meaning of terms across multiple domains, ranging from justice and law enforcement, justice, Homeland Security, Department of Defense, Health and Human Services, to make it, to create, first of all, a basic data dictionary where the terms are mutually understandable, but then a structure for how exchanges could be built and standards could be built. There aren't, most of these use cases or scenarios that Brian's been presenting don't really have standards across domains for information exchanges, and NIEM was supposed to help people come up with ways to articulate a standard and get concurrence across domains on the meaning of terms and the structure of the data. So there isn't really a NIEM system in place. There's really no such thing as a NIEM system. It's really, NIEM is a framework for building information exchanges around specific scenarios. One of the mistakes that I was the first chairman of the NIEM Communications and Outreach Committee, and one of the mistakes that we made in early days of NIEM is we started, when we got people together to talk about how to do this and make these common meanings useful, we focused on data instead of the scenario. And what Brian is trying to do is to help us get more a logical first step. The way to deal with this, how you're going to do this between domains, is to first define a scenario about what the problem is you're trying to solve and how important it is to have a standard for this, and then eventually to build the use case and figure out who's going to how to create a standard and get consensus about that standard across an agreement across the sharing partners. There's all kinds of important issues in any one of these domains. I certainly understand and agree with, since I work kind of in both worlds, with what's been said about what an enormous challenge it is to do this within the domain of healthcare. It's equally a kind of a messy problem to do this within the domain of justice or within the domain of Homeland Security. But and it's not. It is kind of mind-boggling to say we now, in addition to that, you've got to deal with these other domains. But that's the way the world is. The Administration of Children and Families has proposed that NIEM is the standard framework for building exchanges about children and families and other human services applications. And the justice world, including the FBI, have adopted the use of the NIEM framework to build exchanges, specific exchanges. The logical way to deal with this is kind of just what Brian's suggesting is, let's pick one of these scenarios. If we want to do a case study of how to handle this cross-domain interoperability exchange, what we kind of talked about last week was picking one of these. It doesn't really matter which one, but one that can be turned into an actual use case and can be implemented in a way that makes it useful to a lot of people, leading towards a standard for an exchange that people don't have to reinvent this wheel all over the country. And I think what we've talked about was getting started with that.
So I'm still a little confused. Is NIEM, are NIEM artifacts scenario driven like these examples here, or are they sort of data model driven?
They're driven by scenarios to start with, by specific exchanges of information for which there is a model that defines a whole set of data elements. So it's a data model, it's a structure, it's a methodology for how to create those exchanges that satisfy these scenarios.
The other comment that I wonder about, and maybe you have a discrete answer to this, on a previous slide there was a comment about the number of sort of healthcare data elements that are sort of scattered through the other domains. But does that include the demographic data that is likely also common and scattered through? So in fact, you may be understating sort of the level of overlap, right? Because a lot of healthcare interactions require a lot of common demographic data.
I think that's absolutely true.
I did include demographic information, but it was actually a small amount of that information associated with what's called the person data type in.
Well, they have a similar thing like that at NIEM.
Okay.
So we're talking about a dozen, maybe 18 elements that are demographic related out of 326 medical health care related and I think 64 mental health care related elements that I counted up. So that's a relatively small percentage of the health related elements. But I wanted to just put in my little 2 cents worth about this, and that is that for every domain, whether it's the justice domain or the clinical healthcare domain driven by HL7, FHIR, etc., it's human nature to think that this is my realm and I'm going to define things my way using the standards that I work with, and then expect that everybody else is going to follow along, kind of the tail wagging the dog. The problem is that these healthcare elements have been defined within NIEM. They are being exchanged using NIEM. They are not aligned with the healthcare standards, which creates a problem. How do we make sure that the healthcare information that's being exchanged using NIEM is aligned with the healthcare information that the local hospital is using? And that's the problem we're trying to solve here.
But it's worse than that. It's worse than that because you're saying it's not even aligned with itself.
Bingo.
So it seems to me that the first order of business would be to align NIEM health data with itself.
Which is what I have been working on this year and need to continue next year, which is a mapping between HL7 and FHIR elements to NIEM elements, and I've been using the requirements defined in the U.S. Common Data Interoperability specification, aka US CDI for the year 2019, to attempt to little by little map these, map the healthcare standard resources and data definitions into either existing NIEM healthcare elements or new properly aligned healthcare elements. So that at least by the end of next year, I hope to have a complete mapping of at least the 80% sort of focus of FHIR into NIEM, so that we could potentially build a NIEM to FHIR bridge and have the data one-to-one transfer.
Yeah, you know, you're largely focused on FHIR, which I get, but you know, I'm even a level of abstraction above that. So you know, I'm worrying about TEFCA, USCDI, all the high level artifacts that the federal government on the health side are laying out for clinical care and information interoperability over the next 5 years. And NIEM isn't even in that breadth.
You're preaching to the choir. I am one of those federal health architects. And I have been mapping USCDI. And using USCDI as the driver. And using actually the Federal Health Information Model as the Rosetta Stone, if you will, for doing that mapping. Not just for FHIR, but also for HL7, B2.5 program, and HL7B3 if anybody's using that, over into NIEM. So that independent of whether you're using HL7, B2.5.1 or FHIR as the protocol, you'll have a clean mapping between the data resources or elements that are defined there, and the elements on the other side.
Right, but I don't know that anyone. But I don't know that anyone knows that you're doing this.
Or figure out how to map to those.
Well, people know that Brian's doing that because he works on the NIEM Technical Architecture Committee. The C on that, by the way, it means committee. But you're right that one of the problems that we're facing here is that in order for NIEM to work as a cross-domain information exchange framework, there was the notion was that each one of these domains would have a steward, a body that was the steward for that domain would participate in the discussion and the mapping and the kind of harmonization of these data elements across domains. And the other domains have done so, and initially the Department of Health and Human Services CIO signed up and committed to there being a health domain of NIEM would be a partner in this whole effort. And that sort of never really materialized. And so what Brian and Kate have been up to is building a community of interest to figure out how to do this in the absence of that full-blown domain participation by the health community in NIEM, just as much as justice and other domains have participated. So now we're kind of having to play catch-up with the health to do the kind of harmonization that Brian's talking about across these domains. The key thing about NIEM is there's a set of core data elements that are common to two or more domains, and then a whole set of domain-specific data in the model that are unique to the individual domain, so that they can be used by other domains, but are commonly harmonized and referred to and available for people to use to build exchanges. But those core data elements, which includes the demographic stuff that was mentioned earlier, there's 400 different characteristics of a person that is available in NIEM, and a good chunk of them are in the core data elements. But since we haven't had the health domain built out the way the other domains have been built out, we need to figure out how to do this. And again, I think one of the ways to sort of develop an approach is to take one of these scenarios and try to build the exchange actually and put it into practical world. I think that's what we were kind of talking about last week, and it is important to pick a particular scenario and say let's flesh this out and build it and demonstrate it, and so we can see where the problems are and see how we solve them and how we deal with JSON versus XML versus some other way some other mechanism to create these exchanges.
So Paul and Brian, this is Dave. One of the things that I think FHIR has been successful with is having environments where you can actually test your exchanges, That could be Cerner that you're exchanging data with. It could be HL7 itself in the FHIR domain that you're exchanging data with, or I think CMS did a good job with the Blue Button project of having a lot of synthetic data that developers can gather around and say, here's innovative things that can be done based on the data. Is there any vision of doing that in NIEM, having synthetic data that people can be innovative with?
Standard web APIs.
I'm not aware of any, Brian, do you?
Nor I.
And they laughed at it for a long time.
So there's a, let me just say, there's a sort of a separate conversation going on that if you guys can mute or bring it to the table, that would be great.
I mean, if
a little hard to hear.
7 didn't embrace him, there was going to be a revolution where everyone just jumped to using him and stopping using Ann Arbor, Michigan.
Does anyone else hear that aside from me?
It's a fascinating conversation.
Yeah, it sounds good. I'm just wondering if anybody knows that we can mute everybody here.
You can. I think it's this. I think I see them speaking on the participation list. You, as the host, can right-click and mute them. They're the 727-537 number.
Oh, which one is it? 727.
It's 727-537-9474.
Thanks.
Clinical document architecture
for that. Thanks.
Okay. And so then so all FHIR ever
so there's so while Daniel does that, I'm just suggesting that that may be something the NIEM community wants to consider, some base of synthetic data, so you can get that innovation going from the developer's perspective.
Watch me. I get my mind straight for a little while before I talk, because
repeat that. I'm sorry. I'm having a hard time hearing over the background noise.
I think I just got him. Whoever was talking.
So my point, Paul, was since FHIR has been successful with having repositories of synthetic data that the developer community can access and innovate based on, that may be something that NIEM wants to take a look at. Here's a repository of the sample data, synthetic data, that could be used for developers to innovate around.
Agreed.
Yeah, it's a good idea, Dave. I think actually Brian can carry that forward to the NIEM business or the Technical Architecture Committee and call for that. And we need to talk with the DOD, who's now the program manager for NIEM.
Well, it's more like
that kind of,
not so much bringing it into the Technical Architecture Committee as the Business Architecture Committee. But of course, you know, it begs the question of how do we end up using that? And that's where I think a proof of concept from the NIC would be marvelous.
Right.
This is Larry.
Well, I think what we...
Go ahead, Larry.
Yeah. I'm not clear still. I mean, there's been a lot of very interesting conversation, but I'm still not clear on where the group wants to go. So I was wondering, does the group have a document that describes what success looks like with several specific use cases?
Not yet.
I'd suggest that that would be really helpful, particularly for new people like myself, to understand what are you trying to accomplish.
Right.
So I think we were starting to get there by what we talked about last week, was trying to pick one or more of these scenarios and start exactly down that track to define what we're trying to accomplish, and then build towards a use case, and then try to take this into building a demonstration.
I
think last week we
high level, right? Because even at the highest level, if you start with the concept of we want to integrate multiple disparate resources so that they can benefit from collaborative efforts, that's like a first step, and then you kind of be more specific and then more specific and more specific as you drill down into more detail. But right now, I'm still not clear on where you're trying to go. So I think it would be helpful to have some kind of a document that you build, and I think that the online tool that you have will support this, but having some kind of a document that you then fill out over time as you build towards some of these key technical pieces, I think would be helpful for people, particularly as you bring other people on to say, hey, go here, this is what we're doing.
Agreed.
That is exactly the direction we want to go. I would say. I think, as I said earlier, this is Daniel, by the way. So as we started getting into this initially, one of the things was it's a pretty broad palette of areas of interest across various domains. This one jumped to the forefront very early in the early conversation because of that tension between the human services space and the healthcare space, and I'm sure other spaces in terms of we haven't even really even scratched the education space and the exchange of information. While a lot of the conversation has been focused on healthcare, there's also, from a human services perspective, a lot of interaction that potentially could happen with education, also with public safety, and also with public health. And so now it becomes almost a three-dimensional cube in a way that we have other considerations for how do you do that. And I think that we started to talk a little bit about that last year when we started talking about the 6 domains and how do you line these things up? Are there ways that we can exchange information between them? And rapidly saw that each of them was working either without standards or with different standards for exchanging information or data dictionaries. And so it's a very complex beast to get their arms around. I very much like your suggestion of sort of articulating that in terms of what we're trying to do and what piece of that are we going to address first. And in a sort of a virtual community, it's a little hard to do that. But that's actually exactly where we're headed. So I would say we're still in the forming stages of how do we work with this group, both in a expansive way to get different topics of conversations out there, but also in a very pragmatic way of how do we address some of these issues? Because I think that there's the challenge and the misunderstanding about what NIEM is, what FHIR is, what are HL7, how do these things come together is still pretty significant when you start to look at cross-domain exchanges.
Agreed, and I think that if you can utilize some of the processes from startups where you put forward a draft and then quickly iterate the draft, you can come to some kind of a clear understanding of where you're headed early on rather than doing a lot of things in parallel that potentially may end up in a slightly different place than where you're actually trying to be.
Right.
So my suggestion would be if there's 6 different domains, then there's 6 factorial combinatorial combinations, 720 different potential options. But even if you had, say, a dozen use cases that talked about how does education work with human services and how does human services work with healthcare, and you had maybe a dozen use cases. The other advantage of having the dozen use cases, not only does it put a clear picture in people's minds of what you're trying to accomplish, for each of those you can say, and the standards that apply in this transition between these 2 domains are these, right? So it then starts to drive where you actually do development because you understand what specific problems you're trying to solve.
Right. And so I think from an abstraction perspective, going up, to the domain level is a place where we started the conversation a while ago, saying how do we interface across health and education and human services and others, and then began to move down this route to a little more specificity because we ran into this particular issue of NIEM and FHIR and the acceleration that's moving towards.
And I think we're not far from what you're suggesting because I think the sort of early stage we were trying to propose to this group is to not try to deal with the 720 possible interactions, but to pick one or more off of this initial list that Brian has proposed to help illuminate what we're trying to accomplish with a specific exchange or a couple of exchanges that we could get our teeth into as a group and agree on what we're trying to accomplish. And you have to turn them into use cases and then into specifications and then get consensus and move forward. So we were hoping maybe that one thing we could do today was try to vote on, have the group take a vote on which of these should be ones that we do articulate the purpose and objective for.
I think
Does that make any sense?
I think it could be premature because until you have a map of all the different places you want to go, it's hard to prioritize which ones are most important.
Well, this, Tom, might make some sense to look at and kind of start in a place where, some of the, out of all the use cases that we've got, some of them are heavily clinical, some of them are heavily human services, that kind of landing on the ones where there's the most intersection, I think has to do specifically in the realm of this group, I think, has been made a lot of what they call social determinants type information. So there's use cases where the crossover between clinical information and human services information is probably a good place for this group to start. Does that make sense?
Yeah, this is Joe Warren. We could do something as simple as a monkey survey of all these and have people, whoever signed up for these calls, just comment to narrow it down to like 5 of them, and then have a discussion more in depth of those 5.
Well, that certainly is a direction to go. We set up a poll to look at these specifically, but I think that there's I think that would probably be a good way to proceed.
Just to narrow it down,
Yeah. And to a certain degree, I wonder how critical it is. I mean, obviously, we want to pick one that is particularly useful, but even sort of focusing the conversation on specifically what does that mean to be exchanging? I'm looking at the foster juvenile medical record exchange, between the foster care system and the human services system, social services system. That touches so many areas that many people are involved with, I'm sure, of all of these. There's probably a lot of, if you're working in a state or a county, that one is oftentimes not insignificant. I'm sure there are others as well. But just to pick one that would allow us to sort of begin to dive into it. What does it specifically mean to share those kind of records, and what kind of handoffs are necessary? How do you define what the definitions are and the data elements? And I know there was some conversation before on the chat about which of these are where does FHIR start and where does NIEM end? Which are we using either or both, or where they overlap?
So this is Marcelly. I think it's important that we consider that our information systems have been developed to meet specific sector requirements, but we live with people in a life that experience 360 types of experiences that cross over all of them. So what I appreciate about this working group is looking at what are the ways we can overcome the traditional obstacles to see a person as an individual, and if it's in this case, a foster youth, and if it's a transition age youth, then we know there's also some additional resources and priority we can give the youth that if we support them well, they're going to be citizens who can contribute. And if we don't, they become very expensive challenges for communities. I want to be very respectful of the organizations who work very hard to have interoperability within their domain or their subdomain or a piece of it. So I don't want to minimize that. But if you are a person and you have tried to gather up all of your different types of health or education or physical therapy or substance use or mental health, if you're trying in your work information, if you try to gather that, it is seriously impossible at this moment. And not because people don't want it to be able to be done, it's just we have developed our information systems to align with the accountability that's specific to the domain. So the opportunity here is to look at what are all of these components, where is an entry point to be able to provide each other a better capacity to identify roles and verify the roles and the identities. And then from there, look at, there's data structures, it's how we organize and make meaningful the data as it is transmitted or transported or understood. And then there's the interoperability piece of the actual codes that move things around. So between how we serve each other within these domains that are not right now able to connect or serve each other, even though they're individuals or citizens living in the community that have services from all of these different domains, we have the opportunity to better serve them through several of these components between identifying their roles and the verifying their roles and identity, and then also just looking at the possibilities of creating structures that allow us to make better sense of the information that comes from the different domains in a way that can respect the privacy and the requirements.
One of the things that we've talked about is the potential for defining a simple proof of concept that can ignore the complexity of the different scenarios momentarily and try to address some of the issues such as the transport. How do you get the data from point A to point B, or the security that's associated with that, both of which have been addressed in FHIR and are not a focus of NIEM. But one of the approaches would be to have the Let's Get Technical group define the fundamentals that are across all of these scenarios, come up with some proof of concept, some ability to quickly say we're missing, and Brian certainly has expressed one approach, and that is the FHIR to NIEM adapter, if you will, or transformer. I think that we are still going to need to address things like security, and I know there's at least one person on this call who understands that fairly well, but I think there are common denominator problems that need to be addressed regardless of scenario, and it may give us some momentum, if you will, to say all of these things need to be addressed. I'm not absolutely sure whether the request response paradigm in FHIR is appropriate for NIEM transactions, or whether it's some kind of a streaming message server or something else to get the data from point A to point B. But one suggestion would be, let's define some of the low-hanging fruit, fairly simple things that can be implemented to determine what we need to do going forward for all of the scenarios.
Most of the, actually last week, we got a lot of excitement about this NIEM to FHIR bridge concept. However, and I'm using air quotes around that, however we define that. And there was also the suggestion of why can't we just exchange NIEM elements over a FHIR transport, which I thought was an exceptionally good idea, particularly given that most of the NIEM implementations that I have seen are, by the way, have been request response and are just RESTful services or web services based interactions. It's not to say that, you know, there aren't some challenges in alignment between past NIEM implementations and FHIR, but an interesting idea is to simply use FHIR transport for exchanging NIEM elements. But what folks got excited about last week was the notion that a proof of concept could be done that focused simply on the question of, do you have, hello hospital, hello provider, do you have any records associated with this patient? Not exchanging the records, just asking, yes or no, do you have them? Because that involves solving the problems of security on the protocol. It involves patient matching. It involves dealing with person identity and role for the person requesting, and authorization of whether or not they're allowed to ask for that particular information, while at the same time keeping the actual information exchange between a FHIR system and a NIEM system relatively tightly focused.
Yeah, well, so Dave, Brian, others, would it be possible, just for the sake of argument, what we're really getting down to is the most bare bones of data exchange, which is where you have an object that has data in it, and then you have a set of operations that are allowed on that object. If they're both, if you had a payload that was a that happened to be a FHIR resource, you access basically with your APIs, you can get it, you can search it, you can update it. I would assume you could, if you had a NIEM payload, you could do the same thing. The difference then is how do you parse the data that's in that object?
Mm-hmm.
Am I thinking about that correctly?
I believe you are, yes.
So from that standpoint, if you take two objects from the that are related to each other in the social determinants world. Okay, so Medicaid waiver programs require that caseworkers create plans of care for people with multiple needs. So you talked about wounded warriors earlier. Take somebody who's in a traumatic brain injury program. or even better, look at a child who has developmental disabilities. Because there's crossover there. So Medicaid would require a thing called a care plan, and we know that there's a FHIR resource for that. The FERPA would require a school nurse to do an individualized education plan, which can contain some of the same actions, plans of progress, etc. So why not start with something like that, where you've got something from the NIEM world, something from the FHIR world that are similar to each other, and just do this, be able to create one, find one, read it, parse it, and update it. Just
I love
that
the idea.
with, and from there, once you have that little kernel, then the rest of it is variations on the theme, right?
Right.
Yep.
Bravo.
We'll still need to solve the patient matching and the person identity role authorization issues, but it gives us something specific to drive towards in the process of doing that.
Yeah, so if you can get a basic payload that conforms largely to a FHIR spec, a basic payload that conforms largely to a NIEM spec, and able to create it, read it, update it, delete it without electrocuting yourself, then you're somewhere down the road, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We will have a foundation put in place for moving on to bigger and better things.
And like you were talking about earlier, Dave, that gives you a sort of a kernel of synthetic data, because I assume you do this with test data.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe you have a population of 2 or 6 cases that you're working on, but as a place to start, it would have tangible value. wouldn't be wasted, and then you'd have a jumping off point to expand into more complicated subjects.
Mm-hmm.
So let me call attention. We are at 1:30, and we have a stalwart group of people who are remaining on the call, which is terrific. We have had a lot of comments. I think we'll be able to post these comments on the site. We'll have the call for those of you who want to listen to parts of it or all of it. We'll put the slides up there as well. And I'm just got my screen pointed to the group itself here. And I wanted to just pragmatically say, maybe between at least the folks who, between Brian, Dave, Paul, myself, and others who want to sort of do that first draft of outlining what we just talked about, post that up here, and then start to get reactions and responses to it. So again, this would be a good place to do it, and hopefully we can do that before the end of by next week's call. We also have a section on the site that's called Projects, which is just recently. It's an application we added. You can very easily add a project. This might be a good case for it, where we can actually have a specific focus on that project and have the discussion on there, and so that we can focus the conversation so it's not necessarily lost in the larger in the larger group conversations we've had there. So that would be my recommendation, and maybe we can do that if others have a little bit of time to contribute some thinking to it. Maybe we can get that started and then focus in more again next week on kind of how we delineate that exactly. You know, what does that mean, and how do we actually set up a sort of a thinking project plan around that? If that sounds good, then we can use that as a goal or use that as an objective for next week.
This is Brian. That sounds excellent, and I'm willing to roll up my sleeves and start working on that with whoever wishes to join us.
So Brian, I suggest we just put a post up there in the discussion saying you're going to do that, and anyone who wants to join you, feel free to join, and you know, lend your shoulder to it. I think a little momentum here would be great. And if you have resources you want to add or ideas or rather bring other people to the conversation, by all means. And then we can sort of frame that conversation. I think it would be helpful to have that description. I think that Larry was talking about before, which is like, what is it that we're trying to accomplish? So anybody new to the call can say, oh, we're trying to connect, you know, apples and oranges, and here's a way, you know, that we're going to do that through a blender, so to speak. Maybe not a blender, but have a means to do that.
Fruit salad.
Yeah, I like that better. Much better concept there. All right, well, everyone, I will send out another meeting invite. I'll probably send up a new one for the next couple of weeks. I think that the frequency of this is useful, so it stays fresh in our minds. I know it's hard to pick it up and jump into it, but with a little more focus, we can also maybe sort of devote the time to focusing on that, as well as the larger, more difficult conversation of how do we guide this group? How do we have a governance conversation about what are the things that this group might want to engage in? As I said, there are 140 members now who have expressed interest here, and they're all available through, if you click on your little member tab up here, you can begin to see everybody. And I think it's a great idea if folks are so bold as to put a picture up there, you can see. And if you fill out, I've noticed that people have been filling out their profiles a bit more, which is great. And by all means, continue to do that. It will become as good as the people who are using it and as frequently as we're using it. It's also good to see who it is that we're talking with. And I do encourage you to be bold next week and actually turn your video camera on so we see who's talking. I know it's hard to do it the whole time, but it would be a cool thing to do. So I just open the floor for any other comments or quick comments or thoughts that people have before we jump off here. Okay, well, with that then, I want to thank everybody. Have a great weekend. Thanks for contributing. And we'll see you back here in about a week's time.
Thanks, Daniel.
Okay, thanks everybody.
Take care.
Bye-bye.